Back when my daughters were little and we lived in upstate New York, Judith and I used to take them out to eat at Friendly's restaurant in Glens Falls. Have you ever been to a Friendly's? The kids' meal came with what they called a conehead sundae, a scoop of ice cream with 2 M&Ms for eyes and a cherry for a nose, and a sugar cone on top. By the age of 2.5 or so, Rebecca was old enough that I couldn't get away with helping myself to any of her ice cream. But when Martha got to be old enough and we were ordering for kids' meals, old enough to order a kids' meal, and we ordered kids' meals for her, I would swoop over with my spoon and eat about half of hers. I'll never forget the evening that all ended. It's an everlasting part of Fulp-Eickstaedt family lore. Martha was about a year old, still in a high chair, and not yet saying many words. After I finished my meal and the girls had been served their sundaes, I leaned in with my spoon to start on Martha's ice cream. And that's when she suddenly said, "Hey! Hey!" The jig was up. My days of sneaking ice cream from my younger daughter were over. My little girl sensed that something was not quite fair about her daddy taking her ice cream. And she was speaking up for what she thought she had coming to her. When the daughters of Zelophehad, Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah showed up at the door of the tent of meeting where Moses would go to seek God's face, they were coming to speak up for themselves in the face of something that didn't seem fair to them. A census had been taken to determine how many heads of household in each tribe would be in line to receive portions of the land God was about to give into their hand when they invaded Canaan. In a patriarchal and patrilineal system, the daughters of Zelophehad were going to be left out. Their father had died, and they were not yet married, so they were SOL, so to speak. So the 5 of them came to say, hey, there's something not right about this. This system is not fair, nor is it just. It's not our fault that our father died, and he died for his own sin just like anybody else, not because he participated in the failed rebellion against Moses' leadership. He just died. We're the ones who carry on our father's memory, and we should receive what would have been coming to him, whether we're married or not. Now you have to understand that this was quite a challenge to the status quo. The tradition was that property, rights, and inheritances were passed on to men, to male children, and not women, not girl children. That's the way it always been. Thus it is written, thus it shall be, this is the tradition. But these young women sensed the injustice in their father's promised inheritance being given away to others simply because he didn't happen to have a male child. So they showed up, they stood up, and they spoke up. Hey! Moses, who was right there at the door of the tent, took their case with him into his meeting with God. Then God told Moses, these young women have a case. Listen to them, they're right. When there is no son in a family, inheritances should go to the daughters. And if there are no daughters, well then okay, whatever would be given to a man's children, which should go to his brothers. And if he has no brothers, then give it to his uncles. And if he has no uncles, then the nearest male kin in the clan should get it. Now we could get all hung up on the ins and outs of biblical inheritance laws here. But what really interests me is that these 5 women are daring enough to present their case. And there's nothing passive-aggressive about it either. They don't grumble and complain amongst themselves about the unfairness. It's not like those meetings that take place in parking lots after the meeting. You know about those kind of meetings. These 5 young women note their situation, and proactively and assertively go to the person who they think can do something about it, and they state their case. And when they do, Moses, to his everlasting credit, has the good sense to go to God in prayer about it. We don't know whether Moses was favorably inclined to their plea or not, but he was right there at the door of the tent where he went to talk to God, and he knew enough to seek God's will in a time of transition. He didn't say, "We've never done it that way before. The tradition is clear. Here's what the book says." Instead, Moses talked to the living God. In that regard, I think Moses was a bit like people in the last 20 or 30 years who wrestled with and were transformed by the coming out of their gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, neighbors and friends, who said to them and to us, hey, we're beloved children of God too. Make room for us. Be kind and just and loving to us. You know, Moses' mind might never have been changed. He might not ever have even taken it to God if it weren't for the daughters of Zelophehad speaking up for themselves. That set me to wondering, who are the descendants of the daughters of Zelophehad, Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah? Who are the descendants, the spiritual descendants of the daughters of Zelophehad? Well, surely Sojourner Truth was one. Born a slave in New York in the 1790s, she was freed in 1827 and became an outspoken advocate for women's rights and for the abolition of slavery. At the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio in 1851, she said something like this: "Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women of the North, all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man can head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I've borne 13 children and seen most all of them sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman?" Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's it they call it? Somebody tells her intellect. That's it, honey. What's that got to do with a woman's rights or Negro rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man in black over there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God made was strong enough, Sojourner Truth said, to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now that they're asking to do it, the men better let them. Now that is a speech. Sojourner Truth was a descendant of Zelophehad's daughters, if ever there was one. So was Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Clara Barton and Amelia Earhart and Rosa Parks, and so was Ruby Bridges, who was one of the little African-American girls who was the first to integrate the schools in Little Rock. She only just turned 60 in 2014. So are Gloria Steinem and Malala Yousafzai and Margaret Towner, who was the first woman ordained to be a pastor in the Presbyterian Church 2 years after Ruby Bridges was born. And by the way, did you know, I just learned it this morning, that yesterday was Women's Equality Day. But you don't have to be a woman to be a spiritual descendant of Zelophehad's daughters. You just have to have the strength and the courage to show up and stand up and speak up. Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah, they show us that the way it has always been is not the way it always has to be, especially if that way was unjust or damaging to you or to others. Brene Brown is on the money, as she so often is, when she writes, "To love ourselves and support each other in the process of becoming real is perhaps the greatest single act of daring greatly." She could have been writing about Zelophehad's daughters, or about women and sometimes men who leave relationships and homes where they and their children are being abused, and they finally get to a shelter. Or people who admit that they are trapped in a generational cycle of addiction, and they decide that they're going to love themselves enough to be the ones to break the pattern by getting help. Or the people who contemplate suicide, but have the courage, God help them, they have the courage to reach out and say, hey, I need a hand. I'm struggling here. Having said all of that, rather than just seeing ourselves and our families and friends as Zelophehad's daughters, I think it's at least as important to consider how their spiritual descendants keep showing up at the door of our lives, at our tent of meeting, the liminal place where we go to God in prayer. And I'm not just talking about this space or that sanctuary over there. I'm talking about our day-to-day lives. That's where we encounter God. Their stories show up in our news feeds and in our inbox and our daily encounters, if we think about it. The immigrants who flee oppression only to be treated like they're less than human if they don't have papers. And sometimes even if they do. The LGBTQ people whose rights are in danger of being rolled back. People of color who keep showing up and telling us that they continue to be treated differently and unfairly because of the shade of their skin. And don't tell me that's not true. The people who struggle just to have enough to live on in systems that are tilted against them. My daughter Martha spent this past week up in New York being trained to be a Presbyterian young adult volunteer. The other day they took them into the city and talked to them about how they were going to have to learn to live and eat on $3 a day. She's going to be living with 3 other Yavs, and they're supposed to pool their resources. It's a way for them to know what it's like to be really poor. I think I'm going to be sending her some money from time to time. What about the people who don't have daddies? Send them money. Their daughters at Zelophehad too. And when they show up and stand up and speak up for God's sake, can't we learn from Moses to listen and bring them to God in prayer? I mean, honestly, go to God with their requests and their needs and listen for what a God of compassion and love and justice, a God made flesh in Jesus Christ, would tell us about how to respond and how the world might be changed. Their names are Stephanie, Mauricia, Keela, and Quanisha. You might not know their names, but you may know their story since it was national news several years ago. These 4 girls are best friends. 2 are African American and 2 are white. They do everything together and have always done everything together. Yet their senior year, they realized that there was something they could not do together. They could not go to prom together. Although it was not officially sanctioned, their school held 2 proms, a white prom and a black prom. Yes, 59 years after the Supreme Court said that separate but equal was not constitutional, the high school in Wilcox County, Georgia was still holding separate proms. These 2 proms were a long part of the school's history. When the schools were forced to integrate, the school stopped putting on dances and let each group of parents put on their own dances. The white parents put on the white prom and the black parents put on the black prom. They were held the same evening every year. And somehow this continued for 59 years in Wilcox County, Georgia, until these 4 best friends got together in their senior year and said, "We want to go to prom together." Hey. Perhaps the saddest part of the story is that they met quite a bit of resistance from many adults in Wilcox County, including from the state's governor, who called the girls' request for one prom a publicity stunt for the political left. You know what the other adults said? Well, maybe this is a good idea, but old traditions are hard to change. All these girls wanted to do was go to the prom together. So they kept speaking up, and they started a Facebook page pushing for an integrated prom with this prom theme: "Love has no color." And all the other students agreed with them. It was long past time that Wilcox County had one prom for all the students. This group of students, led by 4 teenage girls, stood up and they took a stand. Can you hear them? 4 girls in prom dresses with their arms creating a chain. Hey, hey. Hey, the way you've done things is too small for us. We know there's something bigger and truer, and we're going to do that. Next year, the prom was again put on outside of the school, but it was for both black and white students. And the year after that, Wilcox County High School held its first official school-sponsored integrated prom at the school. The daughters of Zelophehad, Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah, and the prom queens, Stephanie, Mauricia, Keela, and Quanisha, show us what it means to show up, to stand up, and to speak up. You know, ever since Jesus came along, we don't talk so much about inheriting a physical promised land anymore. We talk about inheriting the kingdom of God. And you know what? There's room for everybody in that kingdom.